I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dhamma. I pay homage to the Sangha. Well, before I get on to the topic today, I also wanted to say a few things about the events that have transpired in Sri Lanka. You know, I've only been able to see what's been happening on the outside because of social media. People started posting things around, I think, 11 o'clock last night, our time. And, you know, there's only so much to say when tragedy like that strikes. You know, it's I only feel you know, a lot of sadness for those in Sri Lanka, and you know, the Catholic community there. I mean, they're a small portion of the community in Sri Lanka, but you know, that is their home, and it's a place where they should feel safe, and especially on Sunday morning at their Easter Mass. And so we hopefully had them in our thoughts and our meditation earlier. Later on, we'll be doing chanting, and when we get to the prayer for suffering beings, if you can keep those people in mind while you're saying those words, I would greatly appreciate it. It makes it a little tough for me because my Dharma talks generally are kind of light and goofy, and I try to throw some humor in there when I can. And on a day like this, man, like how do you do it? You know, and the good thing is, as Buddhists, you know, we sort of acknowledge that all life is suffering, and we laugh anyway. So maybe I'll just go on with the topic I had in mind, and if we laugh, maybe it's okay. So the topic for today, I thought that I would take some attention off of myself. You know, the last couple talks, I've really been talking about my own life and things going on there. And at this point, there's really only so much I can entertain people complaining about traffic. You know, and so I think I'll move away from that for a time and get to some sutta study. And hopefully, I can do it in a way that's engaging, maybe a little fun, and you know, highlight some of the stuff that often gets overlooked. And so the sutta I have in mind today is the Ratthapala Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya. And most people, when they quote from this, they quote all the really pithy and meaningful parts, and I'll get to that. But I wanted to tell you the story about Ratthapala first because he's a very interesting monk, the Venerable Ratthapala. Now, Ratthapala lived during the lifetime of the Buddha. He became one of his disciples. And the way this happened is that the Buddha, now probably a good 10 years into his career as a teacher of the Dharma, was going around with a bunch of monks and giving talks and, you know, taking alms and doing what monks do. And at the time, Ratthapala was a young aristocrat, more or less. He was the son of someone pretty powerful. He had wives, he had money, he had youth, all these things going for him. And he heard that the Buddha was going to be giving a talk, and he goes, you know, I'm going to go listen to that talk. And he goes there, and he hears the Buddha give a talk, and it's very moving, and he understands the teachings pretty much right away. He gets it. Like, suffering, that's a thing. I don't want to suffer. How do I not do that? And so he goes up to the Buddha after the talk, and he says, Buddha, I would very much like to be a monk. And please ordain me right now. And the Buddha, at this time, he's already learned to just, not ordain people willy-nilly. He has to ask a very important question first. Do you have your parents' permission? This is very important. And Ratthapala says, no, I just made this choice right now. Okay, go talk to your parents. It's very important you get their permission. So Ratthapala goes back to his parents' home and has a bit of a temper tantrum, but a good, meaningful one that leads to salvation. But at first, it's kind of a temper tantrum because he goes up to his parents and he says, I want to be a monk. And they say, you're our beloved only child. That seems like a bad idea. We wouldn't want to let you go. We wouldn't want to lose you. Even if you were to die, it would be involuntary on our part. We would not want to lose you. So to lose you before your death and you become a monk, that's just way too much for us. He does the very rational thing and says, fine, if you won't let me, I might as well lie right here and die. And you just props himself down on the floor, the bare floor of the house, and waits. Now, this might sound really melodramatic. The thing is, though, this actually happens quite a bit when only children want to be monks or nuns. They have a hard time convincing their parents. I imagine that as my parents' only son, if I wanted to be a monk, they might have some issues. In fact, in my early 20s when I was considering it, they definitely did. So I can understand where Ratthapala was coming from. Like, here's my choice, I want it, please let me. But then I probably wouldn't have just laid on the floor and waited for death. I'm not that melodramatic, but like almost. It actually reminds me of one of the monks in our temple. He's actually not here today, Punyaratana. When he was a child, he was the only child in his family. He wanted to be a monk, and I think he threatened his mother to run away if she didn't let him. So even though it sounds melodramatic, it is a thing that happens. So with the case of Ratthapala, he was on the floor waiting, and his parents come up to him 1, 2, 3 times. Reconsider. You're our only son. Please, stay with us. And you got money. You got wives. I mean, you can do other things and gain merit and still live this sensual life as an aristocrat. He doesn't say anything. Then they do something that is actually pretty smart. They go to his friends. You got to talk to him. He's just lying prone in our living room. You go talk to him. And, we usually listen to our friends when they tell us stuff. It's that whole thing, like if your friend says to jump off a bridge, will you? And, I mean, you might, especially if there's a rope or a parachute. People do that for fun. It makes no sense to me. But, you sometimes listen to your friends. So his friends show up and the same thing. Like, hey, you're their only child. You've got all this stuff. I mean, maybe you want to hold on to it. Your wives might be really bummed out if you take off. Like, why don't you stay and just live this life? And he says, no way. Monk life for me. And they go back to his parents and they say, yeah, we think he means it. I think he's going to die. And so in the commentaries, they say that he stayed on the floor for I think about 7 days or so. And so by the time they finally relented and said, fine, you can be a monk so long as you come and visit us. He got up very weakly because he's starving and thirsty. And so he took a while, but he got up and he was very happy and he went to the Buddha, became a monk. With this, proviso that he go and visit his parents when he could. The commentaries say that that's not quite what happened. The commentaries say that he went off, was a monk, and went off into the forest to meditate and become an arahant, and it took about 12 years. So the sutta itself doesn't really say that 12-year period, but there's a sense that some time has passed, because after he becomes an arahant, he's become a fully enlightened being. He goes to the Buddha and says that he would like to go visit his parents and go take his alms at the palace that he grew up at. And so he goes on his journey. At this point, he's living somewhere else, and so it takes a few days for him to travel down and take his alms and meditate in the forest, and eventually he gets to his hometown. And the commentaries say 12 years because by the time he gets there, not a lot of people can really recognize him. And so he takes his alms bowl and he's approaching the palace, and his father can see a monk coming in the distance. He's actually kind of sitting outside while an attendant is fixing his hair for him. And he sees this monk coming along and he says, "These monks, they stole my son. Unacceptable." So he sends some servants to go shoo away this monk, get rid of him. And so they kind of accost him, push him away, and he's like, "Man, I can't even get some food in my own house? This is ridiculous." But he goes around the palace and he sees a servant who's about to get rid of this old porridge from earlier in the day, and she's about to toss it out. And he comes up and he says, "Miss, if you're going to get rid of that porridge, could you please give it to me? And I'll take that as my alms." And so he presents his bowl to her, and she offers up the porridge to him. But as she's offering the porridge, she looks at his hands, she looks at his feet, she looks at his face, and she realizes that this is the young man that she used to serve many years ago. And she says, "Oh my goodness, I have to tell your mother." And so he goes off and starts eating his porridge behind a shack. No one's paying attention to him over there. But she runs off up to the palace, talks to his mother and says, "You won't believe it, your son is here." And she then runs up to her husband and says, "Your son is here." And then the father goes, "Okay, now I got to track down this monk I didn't realize." And he walks back to the shack where there's this monk just eating porridge. He realizes it's his son, and he sits before him and says, please, take this food and eat it in your home. Come into the palace." And at this point, this monk, Ratthapala, is almost done with the porridge. And he says, "Well, this is actually my meal for the day, so I'm done now. I'm going to go into the forest and meditate." And his father says, "Okay, well, please come back tomorrow then and take your meal." And Ratthapala says, "Okay, that's fine. I'll come back tomorrow, Dad." You know, and so Ratthapala goes off, and at this point, I think he's chosen a king's garden to meditate in because it's nice and there's trees there. So he goes there. His father goes back to the palace and starts scheming because he really doesn't like that his son is a monk. He decides, you know what? I'm going to do a few things to remind him how good life can be. So he decides to get a bunch of gold and hide it under a mat in the room where he's going to be serving his son. And he talks to his son's former wives and says, "Okay, you're going to need to be here for this too." So the next day comes, and Ratthapala comes with his alms bowl, and he sits down, and his father uncovers the gold and says, "Huh? Look, your inheritance. It's your paternal wealth, your maternal wealth, your ancestral wealth, all right here. This is yours. Think of what good you can do with it. Think of all the things you can accomplish with it. Think of all this money." And Ratthapala, an arahant, enlightened being, says, "You might as well throw all of that money in the river for all it's good for. It's nothing to me." Right? And then he says, "Well, what about your wives?" And he brings out this guy's wives, and I don't know how many wives he had, but wives, so more than one. And they come in, and they're trying to touch his feet and hold on to him. Please come back to us. You're off in the woods with the nymphs, but could they be better than us? And he's like, "What are you talking about? Nymphs have nothing to do with it. Please, sisters, don't do this." And they're like, "Oh, sister," and they all faint because they can't believe that their former husband is so chaste now that he would call them sister. And so his father, Ratthapala's father, looks at him and realizes this is a losing battle. And so at that point, he feeds Ratthapala with his own hands. He fills his bowl. And Ratthapala has his meal, and then he departs. Before he departs, he has this poem that he recites, a song that he spontaneously sings about the deer having just missed the trap. And he's like, "All right, bye." And it sounds pretty terse, but for someone who has dedicated their lives to renunciation, to have that thrust upon you, you have to make it very clear that no, I don't belong here anymore. And so he leaves his father's palace. His father is now chastened, realizing, no, this is my son's path. I can't interfere anymore. And they say their goodbyes. So Ratthapala goes to the king's forest of that particular kingdom and goes and sits under a tree. And then now this is where it gets to the sutta study part. But I felt like the story was so good, I had to tell you that first before we get to what might potentially for some of you be the boring part. So the king of this kingdom, I can't remember his name right now, but he was planning on visiting his gardens that day, and so he sends one of his attendants to go out and prepare the gardens for him. Rake the leaves, get stuff ready. Doesn't want to step on any of those pokey things that fall from trees. I understand. Some of those things will go right through your shoe. It's no joke. So I understand why he wanted the path cleared before he went into his garden. The attendant sees Ratthapala meditating there. And he says, "Oh, I have to let the king know that this is happening so he can be aware that there's a monk in the garden." Not in any bad way, just so that the king is aware. Like, well, if you're going to be in your garden, someone's there already. And he goes to the king, and the king says, "All right, forget about being entertained in the garden today. I'm going to go speak to the monk." And this king, because Ratthapala used to be an aristocrat, he knows Ratthapala. He's aware of him and his wealth and his standing in society. And so he's curious. I have to talk to this monk. And so the king walks up to Ratthapala and he says, "Ratthapala, I'm very, very confused. You're a monk, but generally people who become monks, who shave their head and put on the saffron robe, they've suffered these 4 losses. They've suffered the loss of their youth, or the loss of their health, or the loss of their wealth, or the loss of loved ones. And you haven't seemed to have lost any of those things. You're still young. You still have black hair. You have your health, or you have no stomach problems or anything. And you came from a family with so much money and so much prestige. And you have all these friends and family in the world. And why would you become a monk? What could you possibly get out of it? And then this is where Ratthapala gives 4 summaries of the Dhamma. And so this part I'll read because I didn't memorize this part. You'll see why. So Ratthapala says this: Great King, there are 4 summaries of the Dhamma that have been taught by the Blessed One, who knows and sees, the Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one. Knowing and seeing and hearing them, I went forth from the household life into homelessness. What are the 4? Life in any world is unstable. It is swept away. This is the first summary. Life in any world has no shelter and no protector. This is the second summary. Life in any world has nothing of its own. One has to leave all and pass on. Life in any world is incomplete, insatiate, the slave of craving. So those are the third and fourth. So the king looks at Ratthapala and says, okay, maybe, but what do these things mean? Let's look at the first one. What does it mean that life in any world is unstable, it is swept away? And Ratthapala says, well, king, when you were a young man in your 20s, were you weak in arm and leg? Were you a weak warrior? And the king says, well, no. In my 20s, I had so much strength in my arms and legs. I thought I had superpowers. And Ratthapala says, okay, well, how about now? And the king says, well, I'm in my 80s, and I feel very weak in my arms and my legs, and I want my foot to go one way, and it goes another. And so he sees, okay, maybe there's something to that. But what about the second one? Life in any world has no shelter and no protector. And then Ratthapala says again, well, king, your health at the age of 80, what is it like? Do you have any ailments? And so the king says, well, yes, I have a wind ailment. And so at this point, he must have had trouble breathing. And he says, yes, when I'm afflicted with this, my friends and family and my attendants around me all think, oh no, he's going to die. And it comes on very suddenly. And Ratthapala says, well, are you able to share that pain with anyone? Can you share it with friends and family and attendants so that it affects you less? And he says, no, whatever I suffer alone. My afflictions are my own. When I have these feelings, it's mine. And no one can take it from me. And he says, oh, no protector then. And then we get to the third. Life in any world has nothing of its own. One has to leave all and pass on. And the king says, well, again, what would the meaning of this be? And Ratthapala says, well, king, you must have a lot of wealth, a lot of chariots, a lot of gold, a lot of bullion, all these things. And the king says, yes. And Ratthapala says, well, what happens when you die? Do you take any of it with you? And he says, no, I have to leave it all behind. Well, who does it go to? Well, I assume it goes to my descendants, it goes to people around me, friends and family that I might bequeath it to. That's what happens. But you can't take any of it. No. It's temporary. I can't take it wherever it is I go after this life. Interesting. Maybe Ratthapala has a point. And then they get to the fourth one. Life in any world is incomplete, insatiate, the slave of craving. And the king, again, very confused, well, what's the meaning of this one? And Ratthapala says, well, king, you have this very large kingdom. You have so much land, you have so much wealth, you have so much that you've already accomplished and so much that you rule. But if a trusted advisor came up to you and said, in the north and in the east and in the west, there are these other lands and they have more riches and they have more wealth and across the sea as well. Well, what would you do with that information? Well, I'd get my warriors together and we'd invade and we'd conquer and we'd take that wealth as our own. But you already have all of this. Oh yeah, but you would conquer that land too. Yes, most definitely. Interesting. So whatever you have isn't enough. And so they have this discussion, and And we see then that Ratthapala has addressed all of the concerns that we have in life with our desires and our wants and our cravings and our views of life as being permanent. And so these 4 summaries manage to capture quite a bit. They manage to capture the essence of the Dhamma. They manage to capture the 3 marks of existence, of impermanence, unsatisfactory, and no self. They manage to capture a lot of the 4 Noble Truths, I'd say at least the first 3 on the nature of suffering. And more importantly, the lesson that we get from Ratthapala is that he didn't need to suffer in those ways himself to see that there is suffering in those things. Now, I relate to that to an extent. I didn't go off and run off and become a monk, but I did kind of run off to the Dharma at a very young age. I ran off at around 12 or so, when most people don't really think of suffering. I certainly wasn't thinking of suffering. I wish I had been as wise as Ratthapala to see the immediacy of approaching the Dharma, because at any moment these things could happen. Life is very, indeterminate. We never know what's around the next corner. For me, I was just a kind of a bored, pudgy kid in the suburbs, really interested in religion. But Ratthapala could see already that as a young man with so much ahead of him, that all of it was fleeting. Now, tying it to the news that some of us woke up to this morning, I think it puts the lessons in stark relief, because we really don't have anything that we can hold on to in this world. This is what the Buddha tells us, that everything just kind of just slides right through our fingers. It just comes just like sand. It's like trying to grasp sand. It just all falls right out. But what we can grasp onto is the Dharma and the teachings there, to become kinder, more loving, more accepting, more generous, less prone to anger, less prone to aversion, and we can grow in wisdom. And Ratthapala saw that as a young man, with plenty of time to do something about it. Some of us have those opportunities and some of us don't, but the fact that we're here today, to me, is a sign that we have at least this opportunity right now to think about our lives and what matters most, to think about our lives and the kind of things that we want to accomplish. Do we want to accomplish the material goals of the world and get more money and status? Do we want more Instagram followers, more people following us on Twitter and all that? Do we want our name on a newspaper somewhere? Or do we want peace? And the funny thing about peace is that from the outside it looks kind of boring. I think that's why Ratthapala's family had such an aversive reaction to him living the life of a renunciant. Because from the outside, to them, it was as if their son had died. He just went off into the forest to go meditate. And even today, a lot of people really don't understand the benefit of following the Eightfold Path, but even just in a general sense, meditating. It looks like a very strange action from the outside. It looks a lot like doing nothing. And if you're doing it right, maybe it is. But the goal of meditation, the goal of all of the Eightfold Path, is to grow in wisdom, to grow in love. We are literally nurturing and training our heart and our mind. One of the ways of talking about meditation is chitta bhavana. Bhavana being a word for cultivation. And the roots of that word have all of the connotations of kind of digging up the soil. It's a real beautiful word, bhavana, cultivation. And chitta means not only the mind, but the heart. It means that whole system of thought and emotion. And it's something that we're developing. It's something that we're cultivating. And we're pulling out all of those weeds of greed, of hatred, of delusion. And Ratthapala could see that. He could see that that's what he needed to do. He understood that he needed to go off. Now for us, going off might be different. I think for the majority of us, we're not going to be putting on robes anytime soon. But we have a way to make our life more conducive to developing wisdom, to developing loving kindness, to develop compassion and loving friendliness and equanimity. We have choices to be made. Recently, I read an article where it was turning that FOMO thing on its head, fear of missing out. A lot of people feel that today because there's so many things out there So many shows to binge watch on Netflix. I'm still making my way through the Great British Bake Off. It's good TV. A lot of movies out there. The new Avengers is coming out next weekend, I think. And there's so many things to experience. A lot of people are out in Coachella right now, which is probably why the driving's much less recently in LA. All these experiences out there. And we have this fear of missing out that keeps us scrolling, that keeps us active, that keeps us out. We all got to find the new dive place before it gets trendy and everyone knows about it. All these things going on. And this article that I had read, and I wish I remember the person who wrote it, but they changed it to the joy of missing out. And when you live a life that has any bit of renunciation in it, yeah, you got to find some enjoyment in that. Otherwise, you're not going to have that steam. Last month I talked about the importance of determination or discipline, that we can't always wait around for motivation. But we also still need some motivation because that's the fuel. So you have to find some joy in maybe renouncing things a bit. Maybe spending less time online. Maybe not watching that movie. Maybe you spend a weekend in. Ooh, that's a big one for a lot of people, especially in LA. So many things to do on the weekends, I wouldn't know a lot about it. No one invites me to things. But they know now not to because I usually don't go. But I usually try to find time for stillness. Try to find time for introspection. Try to find time for meditation. And I also try to live my life in a way that I can actually cultivate the precepts, the 5 precepts, to avoid killing, which, is fairly easy, but also to avoid stealing, and for me that's pretty easy, but avoid sexual misconduct. That's not so easy for a lot of people. For me, probably a little easier. Married life kind of does that for you. And then 4th, to avoid lying. This one's tricky because sometimes it's so easy to lie. One of the biggest ones that people lie about all the time is, "How you doing?" "Great." And that's the biggest one. We all do that. And that's still a lie, isn't it? That's still going on like, "Oh, I'm great." "Are you? You look like you lost a little weight." "Yeah, I was very sick, but how you doing?" "I'm great." Poking a little fun at Benita. Everyone's commenting on how much weight he's lost. But we all have these little white lies, and we think they're harmless. Maybe not. Maybe we can live a life devoid of white lies. Ooh, that could be tricky. All right. Now the 5th one that even I struggled with for a while, and I say even I because the 5th one involves intoxicants. And the thing is, I never really liked alcohol anyway. I just drank because of social pressure. People go out for drinks, and they're like, "You want to drink too, don't you?" "Yeah. What are you guys having?" "We're having whiskey." "Oh, great." And then they'd pour the whiskey, and I'd drink. I would take a sip, and my body would react as if poison had just entered my mouth. My body would literally not let me swallow. It would just sit on my tongue. Oh, that's smooth. Yeah. And it's awful, but we all do it because I guess we think it's fun. I always liked the more fruity stuff anyway. Give me a good pina colada or a mojito, and that's probably as adventurous as I get. All the other stuff out there I've never really tried. But then that can be tough too. But we can live a life where we can make those things easier. One of the good things about being at a meditation center is that there aren't going to be a lot of chances for those things. We don't got a margarita machine in the back. I can promise you that. We got tea, and you'll have some later probably. We got cookies almost every weekend. So there's probably some of that. And you're probably going to find people who are very honest about where they are on the path and what kind of accomplishments they've had. No one's making promises that they've become enlightened and they're levitating out back either, right? So if you go to a place like this, you're more likely to be able to avoid killing, avoid stealing, avoid sexual misconduct, avoid lying, and avoid intoxication. I think that's probably one of the reasons people like to come here on New Year's Eve too, because that way you avoid all the parties. So that's one way of doing that. One way of approaching renunciation. Now, I'm a bit biased because I'm a bit monk-like. If just 2 or 3 choices in my life had gone differently, I'd probably be up here in a robe rather than jeans and a Dickies button-up. But my life has gone a certain way. But I still have that inclination to renounce things and live a simpler kind of life. Now, you'll notice I not all the way, because I still have a Netflix account and Amazon Prime, The Tick Season 2 just came out. So I know about things. I'm clearly a part of the world. But I also make room for the other stuff that, for me, is more important. The Eightfold Path of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So I would like to think that when I read about disciples of the Buddha like this, like Ratthapala, I can at least take on some of those qualities and at least train up some of those qualities so that, like him, I can be a kinder, more loving person who understands what really matters, what is really meaningful to my life, and what's more likely to lead towards peace than not. So I will end with a short poem that Ratthapala recites at the end of the sutta. I don't have it in here because this is a really handy anthology. My other books are currently in storage, and the thought of trying to find which box the Majjhima Nikaya is in right now would be awful. So I found it online, like a good millennial. So the passage I'll read, I won't read the whole thing, it's very long, but I will read a small part of it that I find very meaningful. And I think, again, held up to what's happened in the news lately, it's in stark relief. I think this really highlights what we all might be feeling and thinking. So keep that in mind. Longevity is not acquired with wealth, nor can prosperity banish old age. Short is this life, as all the sages say. Eternity it knows not, only change. The rich and poor alike shall feel death's touch. The fool and the sage as well shall feel it too. But while the fool lies stricken by his folly, no sage will ever tremble at the touch. Better is wisdom here than any wealth, since by wisdom one gains the final goal. So, I think I will end with those wise words. Let's all think about it. Thank you.